now to the business of the day, and without further ado, I call to the podium our Chair of the Day, Helen Moylan, to take over today's meeting.
Thank you, President Adrian, and good afternoon, members and guests. It's my very great pleasure to be able to introduce today's special guest, the 2022 recipient of the Rotary Club of Melbourne's Vocational Services Award, Robert Pradelin. This award has been presented annually since 1964 to acknowledge the importance and value of vocation in Rotary. It's given to a resident of Victoria who has not only achieved excellence in their vocation, but used those skills to go above and beyond to make a significant contribution to the community. As you've heard, Robert's in very distinguished company as this year's recipient today. We're delighted we have so many previous recipients with us. Robert, as you can tell from the many Rotarians here, and this is a good turnout given a post-COVID reluctance, shyness to come back in, and the poor 20 people who are trying to get in online, this particular award and the work that you do have strongly resonated with our members. The lack of affordable housing for so many Australians across a wide spectrum of needs and circumstances has coincidentally featured prominently in this week's newspaper, including this morning's front page of The Age. And there's a rising tide of awareness in the community for a need for action to remedy what's going on. Robert was unanimously chosen for this award by the Vocational Services Committee due to his outstanding commitment to creating awareness of the extent of homelessness in the community and to instigating business-led solutions. So rather than go through Robert's extensive CV, I'm going to read you the citation which accompanies this award, and I'd like to thank Cynthia Edgell for her assistance with this. And this will give you a very clear picture of his background and achievements. So Robert's citation reads, the 2022-23 Rotary Melbourne Vocational Service Award recognises the service of property developer Robert Pradelin. Robert Pradelin's career mirrors the criteria for this award. He has excelled in his vocation in real estate and residential property development, and then gone on to use his skills to benefit the community. A civil engineer and registered builder with a graduate diploma in property and an MBA, Robert spent almost 2 decades working in senior executive positions with Fraser's Property, formerly Australand, in residential property development. Currently self-employed as a strategic advisor in the property business, he now uses his experience, skills and connections to help vulnerable Australians. He believes that without stable housing, a person's ability to contribute to society is greatly curtailed. Robert is a director of the Salvation Army Housing Boards and Summer Housing, a service for the disabled. In 2019, he founded Housing for All Australians, HAA, a private sector initiative where Australia's corporates come together to help the homeless. He sees social and affordable housing as an economic infrastructure issue requiring both public and private investment. Robert's development of HAA arose out of his realisation that many people, particularly women, were homeless, while there were thousands of empty buildings across the country that could be used for short-term shelter. The HAA model first locates buildings that are slated for redevelopment and likely to be empty for 2 or more years, while large-scale projects are designed, approved, financed, and marketed. Next, he contacts the local housing charity that can identify vulnerable people who need shelter and provide them with appropriate support. He then uses his contacts in the property industry to encourage big firms to make the buildings habitable. Finally, he gets the buildings fitted out with second-hand furniture donated by upmarket hotels. Ultimately, Robert wants to develop a business-led revolution in the provision of affordable rental housing. As governments cannot fund the problem alone, they must be persuaded to offer the appropriate financial settings to achieve the required returns by offering tax incentives or direct subsidies that will entice super funds and others in the private sector to invest in affordable housing. This would generate jobs in the construction sector and encourage innovation in prefabrication. Robert's concern for the homeless and innovative approach to providing solutions epitomises the Rotary ideal of service above self. He joins a distinguished body of men and women who have been previous recipients of this award. And I'll now call upon President Adrian to present Robert for this award.
Ladies and gentlemen, please congratulate Robert Pradelin.
Thank you, President Adrian, and thank you, Helen. And I am very honoured with this award, but also very humbled, because the distinguished people who've got it previously to me do far greater work than what I do, because all I do is I use what I've learned over my career, and to me, it's just easy to do. But in speaking to Helen during the week, she said, do you mind recounting some of the stories that led you to do what you're doing and why? So I hope you'll indulge me, and I'll sort of share a bit of that, but I will end up with an economic report that we announced nationally in June this year, which gives some horrific figures about how and where we're leaving our country for our grandchildren. But as Helen said, I'm actually a property developer. I'm actually a capitalist. I believe in market forces. And people say, why is a capitalist talking about social housing? That's for the do-gooders. Well, I've actually learned that it's got economic consequences for all of us. And as you've heard, I'm a developer. I've developed land subdivisions, medium density housing, 60-storey buildings in South Bank. And like most Australians, I assume that while we're doing things in business, government's looking after vulnerable people. And I discovered that they weren't. In fact, I discovered more that all these vulnerable people that have these unintended consequences, which is physical and mental health, family violence, justice, policing, long-term welfare dependency, it costs an economy a lot of money, as well as the social unrest. So there's a few little vignettes which I'll share with you, which ultimately led to housing all Australians, but nothing in itself was the trigger, except for one point towards the end. But I do recall when I was on a panel with a Melbourne University professor called Caroline Witzman, and I've always had the view that academics are too academic, and perhaps us in the private sector, we're too sort of practical. And I said we should get together to test our thinking and try to learn new ways of doing things, because something just wasn't working. And I recall one of the incidents, one of my watershed moments was we were at Melbourne University, we had private sector financiers come from New York, talk us about affordable housing. And I still can visualize this person. He's called Mark Jarr. And he said, in New York, we consider key worker housing as infrastructure for our city. A light bulb moment. This is not housing we are talking about. It's economic infrastructure for a prosperous country. Because without shelter, we have unintended human consequences. And that spans into a person's lifetime. Where we've allowed our country to get to will take 40 years to recover if we start today. So that was one of the little vignettes. And another one that happened, I was actually talking to my daughter and having a cup of coffee, and some of you may have heard the story, into Grave Street, opposite Flinders Street Station. And a couple of days before, in one of the news channels, there was a news story about the Grand Hall above Flinders Street Station being empty for 10 years. Anyway, this homeless guy came up and asked us for some money to find a bed for that night. So we gave him a few coins, and we had a discussion. And I said, what a disgrace. We've got an empty building upstairs where Melbourne's icon is, which is Flinders Street Station, staying empty for 10 years. And below it, we have people sleeping rough. And I said, I wonder how many buildings in Melbourne are empty. Anyway, I started working with Launch Housing and City of Melbourne. And one day I got a phone call from the City of Melbourne saying the ABC News has heard the idea and they like it. They want to do a story. I said, but we haven't found a building yet. But as I've always done through my career, I always return journalists' calls, even if I have no comment. And he said, look, Rob, the ABC studios are undergoing renovation in South Bank. Let's pretend that's an empty office building. So we did. I was on the ABC News that night. I was on Neil Mitchell the next day for half an hour. And then I started getting calls from a whole range of people, very wealthy families, all the way down to a homeless guy that found me on LinkedIn and said, I'm one of the great unwashed. Thank you for trying, and everything in between. And they all said the same thing. We know we have an issue. Just tell us what you want us to do. And through that process, I discovered that women over 55 were the fastest growing cohort of homeless in Australia. And as a man, I didn't know that. I was actually quite ashamed. And there's some of these pivotal moments where you sit back and say, that's disgraceful. Government should do more about it. And wait. Or maybe, given the feedback of it, maybe if I start something, maybe there's others out there that are like-minded and might want to help. And the other little milestone, because you know, some of you may not know, but we start 3,000 charities a year in Australia. We need to consolidate. So I had to be really convinced to start another one. And I said this morning to Catherine Brown, the CEO of the Lord Mayor's Charitable Fund. I said, I use your story a lot because I say it was you that tipped me over the edge, because you said yours is different. Because Housing All Australians is a private sector initiative looking at housing homeless with a commercial lens. Because if we do not do it commercially, we will never solve the problem. The federal government estimated last year in a report from a review of their National Finance Corporation that the size of the issue in front of us is $290 billion of underinvestment. That will never be solved by government. And government are not innovators. The private sector is. So we started this journey with a few like-minded corporates, Quest Apartment Hotels and Metricon. And there was an old, because I was on TV, an old Rotary colleague from Albert Park, David Gorman, rang and said, Rob, I'm actually a director on Casper Care. We've just developed a new aged care facility in South Melbourne, and the existing one of 52 rooms is empty. We feel guilty. Cut a long story short, we engaged with Casper Care. We arranged for a long-term peppercorn lease with the YWCA because we just provide the shelter. We'll always do it with a not-for-profit that provides the services, which are just as important. We had Metricon and their subbies and suppliers come in and renovate 32 rooms for free. Crown Plaza Hotel provided the furniture for 32 rooms when they were refurbishing a 300-room hotel. The other 270 rooms had to go to the tip because no one wanted the furniture. That's another story. So we developed 32 rooms where the YWCA have helped now women over the last 3 years at no capital cost. Those 32 rooms have helped over 107 women stabilise their lives for free. We just finished one in Box Hill. Salvation Army had an empty building for 7 years. Peppercorn lease, 5 years for YWCA. Quest Apartment Hotels, Metricon, program maintenance, did $200,000 work for free. We're doing this in Perth for Uniting, where the industries got together to provide architectural services, a whole range of things, $1 million pro bono. And with that, they then leveraged it and got $3 million from the state government to provide 14 self-contained rooms for women that are vulnerable. And we're doing this in Sydney, in Adelaide, Queensland. We're now a national organisation, except for the Northern Territory, with value-aligned private sector organisations that have always wanted to try, but never knew actually how to do it or how to do it through. I'm a member of South Bank Rotary. One of those connections introduced me to the Chief Operating Officer at Dulux. Dulux is now a national supporter. Tell me how much paint you want, and I'll give it to you. $400,000, doesn't matter, just tell me what you want, because it's in kind. Ask for 10,000 cash, that's a very different story. So our model is aligning our ask to corporates that want to solve this problem, because it is a community problem. It is not a government problem. It is our problem. What are we leaving our grandchildren? Well, I reckon we're on a lose-lose trajectory. As we release an economic study, there's 4 pillars of what we're doing initially. One's the pop-up shelters, which we've heard about. The other key one is to change the narrative from a social issue to an economic one. We engage an economist funded by the industry, Simmons, Metricon, Quest, Jennings, 20 corporates funded it. And we produced a study saying, what is the long-term cost to Australia if we do not provide sufficient social and affordable housing? The economic cost. And if we allow governments to continue doing what they are doing, which is tinkering around the edges, in 30 years' time, we've taken 2051 because This is economic infrastructure, and the super funds want a 30-year investment horizon. So by 2051, in today dollars, it's an extra 25 billion per annum. The whole irony of that is if we can afford to spend that by 2051, we would have spent $78 billion doing all those unintended consequences. So the real concern I've got is by 2051, at 25 billion extra per annum in today dollars, not $51. I reckon we won't be able to afford to do that. So what happens? Our Australian values get watered down. We are heading for a lose-lose scenario. Now, that report was national. It's got a fair bit of coverage. It was used at the Jobs and Skills Summit. I believe it's on Premier Palaszczuk's desk as a must-read because they're now doing their housing summit. We're talking the Tasmanian government, the New South Wales government. It is all just lip service at the moment because I don't trust politicians because they are running about votes. So what we are trying to do is create respectful unrest by educating the public and business about what they don't know. Because once they are fully informed, I think they'll make a different decision when it comes to the democratic time of voting. Because without political unrest, there is never any, so without respectful unrest, there is never any political self-interest. And it's all through business. And I've been inundated, and I spend days talking to businesses when they hear about what we're doing, about how they can help, because they all care. As private sector, we've got a big problem. Everyone thinks the private sector businesses are all greedy bastards. And the development industry is even worse. But that's not true. We all care, but we have to run our business to be sustainable. So my challenge to everybody here is what businesses are out there that can help in a small way to what we're doing nationally. Because together, if everyone does a little bit, we can change the whole dial. And then we can start to say, we've tried to do something to leave our grandchildren with a better society than what we are leaving today. Because I got to tell you, I don't like the trajectory that our country's heading on. We're all fine, but where's the trajectory that our country's heading on? I just think it's disastrous unless we, the private sector, have a voice and use it. It's not necessarily money, it's having a voice. So look, I'd like to finish off on that point. I'm not sure whether we've got time to show that video about, is it ready? Very quick, it's only 2 minutes. This is a documentary that I was asked to be involved with. It's about women over 50 being the fastest growing cult of homeless. It's stories about the women, middle-class women. It launched the Melbourne International Film Festival on the 3rd of August. As of the 6th of October, it's been launched nationally at the Palace Cinemas and through others. Have a look at it, get your daughters to see it and say, this is not where we want you to end up. There's a whole range of things, education, financial literacy, all that stuff. But we as men, I'm saying them particularly men, we should never allow this to happen. And the question I leave you is, what are you going to do about it? So thank you very much.
This is my home.
I actually didn't realise that all this homelessness is happening for women 55 and over.
Kicked out when I'm 84, that's not a pleasant feeling. I didn't expect it. I did not expect it.
We've all done the right things, you know. We've got married, we've stayed at home, we've raised our children.
Everyone who looks down on homeless people thinks these people have done something wrong or they deserve or they just need to work hard.
You're past a certain age, experience counts for nothing, apparently. You can't go forward, you can't go back. I couldn't afford to live there and I couldn't afford to move.
I have actually lived in a car for nearly 3 years now.
The marriage breaks down and you don't have a house and you've got no career as such to fall back on.
I'm 68 years old. I will never own a house. I'm a bit afraid of the day when I have to leave again.
I just don't feel safe anyway, really. I always look over my back. always.
Here I am at 71, and I don't think I've still woken up to the fact that, you know what, sometimes life just doesn't turn out how you think it will.
I couldn't believe this was me. I couldn't believe after all these years that I would be in this situation.
I had never, ever considered that I would be homeless. Never.
Oh, that's very sobering, Bill. Rob's very kindly agreed to take some questions. So if you would like to ask a question, I think Bernie is going to go around with the microphone. If you could stand up and give Rob your name and state your name clearly, and then ask your question, please.
My name's Peter Rogers. Congratulations on what you're doing. It's a great story and we're all pleased to hear that. In Victoria, there's a scheme that whereby I think if developers can get government land and produce 15% of the housing as social housing, they're able to do a deal to develop the larger precinct. Now, I've probably not described the way that works, but I was just wondering what you think of that and what the potential is there, and to what extent that contributes to solving this problem.
At the end of the day, the first thing we all have to recognise is social and affordable housing requires a subsidy. You can't do it for free. And if developers buy a site, they buy it under the same rules. And if you then add another impost to it, it's not viable and you can't do it. That's why developers scream when the Victorian government tried to introduce a social housing levy, because they've already bought the site. You need to put it in so far in front of it before they've bought it, because it actually means they pay less for the land. That state government initiative is that the state government then gets less for the land because the subsidy comes off the price of the land. So it is possible, but you've got to acknowledge that the business community or the developers have to make a reasonable return for risk. And when you buy something in good faith and then you change the rules, you're going to get people upset. No one thinks long-term enough. I had this discussion 13 years ago when the Bracks government was looking at doing what they call inclusionary zoning, which is you must do 10 or 15% of affordable housing. And all the developers were banging their fists because they wanted to introduce it back then. And I said, stop. What happens if the government says, we want to look long-term? We want to introduce that inclusionary zoning today, but it will not take effect for 10 years from now. Who around the table would object? Not one, because they hadn't bought it yet. No one thinks long-term enough. They think in 3 and 4 year election cycles. And they want to do something now because they want to take credit for it. It's all about votes. Let's be frank about it. It's all about votes. No one thinks long-term for Australia and what our country needs, except the private sector. Yes, you do get some politicians that want to do the right thing. They get consumed by the machine. Doesn't matter which side of politics you're on. And if we're going to solve this, the private sector needs a voice. And if you look at the marriage equality side, where Alan Joyce convinced his board to go out on a potentially polarising issue, there is nothing polarising about shelter. We all get it. And it's quite sad that we've got to do an economic report to justify that the cost benefit, which I didn't touch on, it's a no-brainer. For every dollar you invest, you get $2 back in cost savings. It's a real pity you're going to do an economic report for something that everyone understands intuitively. It's a fundamental human need. And I just want to say one more point. I've gone on the record saying I don't believe that housing is a human right, because that is a decision for society to make. And it always fragments society. Half say yes, half say no. But no one's ever said it's not a fundamental human need. And without it, we have unintended human consequences. Let us use the language that unites a population, not one that divides it. It's the same thing. So language is quite important. But look, it is possible. It's an acknowledgement that it requires a subsidy. The state then get less for the land and developers go ahead and build it. It's very possible. And I've come to the view too, having developed the Commonwealth Games Village, the Carlton housing redevelopment, where we got sold the land by government, we had to return so many social houses, then we sold it to the private sector. If it's public land, it's too scarce. My view is lease it for 40 years for $1, change all the economics, then it comes back to us, the public. Because let's face it, once you've sold a piece of public land, it is gone. And who knows what the future society might want to do with that piece of land. Doesn't mean we don't do nothing with it. Let's think smart and think a bit outside the square. And that's again where I think the private sector has some real innovation about it. So I hope that answered the question.
Robert Pradelin, I've got a question. It's all very well for the developers to be interested. What about the funders of the developers? Are they on board? Are there any of them?
Well, let me, and I normally ask the audience this question first, but I'll just go straight to the chase because our super funds have billions of dollars invested in housing Americans and basically zero in Australia because it just doesn't stack up. We are too expensive, the rules are not right, so they are forced, because it's not the super funds' fault, they're forced to invest housing Americans, Canadians, and people from the UK. They want to invest here, they've all said yes, but we're not a charity. So in simplistic terms, if the government tops up the uneconomic bit, the funds will flow back. And in fact, in our economic report, we say in this by 2051, if the government invests 50 billion over a period of 30 years, we will save 110 billion in costs. So the business case is a no-brainer. In Victoria, because we've broken up in states and territories as well, in Victoria, for every dollar we invest, we save $3.3. What's the suburban rail loop? It's down to 1 point something. We're not saying don't invest in infrastructure. Just look at the impact that housing has on our society, and the benefits far outweigh all those major projects. So we really say that this type of housing is an infrastructure for a country. And if you've got a country that's housed and fed, they're productive citizens and taxpayers, not welfare recipients. And that's part of that sort of strategy.
I don't think we've got any online questions. If we have, I can't see them. So thank you everyone for your questions. Robert, congratulations again on your award. And thank you for all that you're doing with industry, with governments, and with the community generally to bring awareness and solutions to the wicked problems of homelessness. And thank you for sharing with us today some of your insights into your work. Could we please thank Rob again for his presentation? Thank you to our distinguished past award recipients for joining us today, along with all our special guests. And also thanks to our MC Bernie McIntosh, to past President Robert Fisher for his reflection, and to our lunch setup and reception teams for their efforts. If anyone can stay back for a few minutes to assist with the pack up, their help would be much appreciated. I've been asked to give some final notes. Next week, the regular monthly evening meeting will be held at the Lyceum Club, and please look in the newsletter for further details about that, and we hope you can join us there.